Good morning, everyone. I'm very glad to see you here on the second day of our workshop. And I'm delighted to have to present the first invited speaker. I'm co-chairing with Toshimichi all the invited talks, as well as the session 4 that will start immediately after Nick Brown. And I have to say that, so we are representing the International Program Committee here. It has been difficult to find invited speakers because there's so many people that would like to hear about, but we have to make a choice. And for this first talk, we thought we wanted to hear from the geodesy at a different plane that most of us here in this room probably are used to work on. We are talking now about the geodesy of the big halls and rooms of the international committees and United Nations. And I'm very glad to have Nick Brown with us here today. Nick is making an effort to be with us remotely from Australia. I'm going to say just a few words. Those of you who had the pleasure to be in Canberra 3 years ago, or whatever it was, 2019, I think it was, may have met Nick there. Nick is from Geosciences Australia. He's the director of National Geodesy, that organization, and co-chair of the Global Geospatial Information Management Subcommittee on Geodesy. A member of the Intergovernmental Committee on Surveying and Mapping, chair of the Intergovernmental Committee on Surveying and Mapping Geodesy Working Group, and a member of the International Federation of Surveyors, Commission 5. Nicholas is responsible for the development and refinement of the Australia Geospatial Reference System. Nick is actually a geodesist too. He's got a Bachelor in Applied Science and Geomatics from the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology in Australia, and a Master's in Geophysics and Space Geodesy from the Australian National University. So Nick, hear from you on this talk that I hope it will be stimulating and interesting to all our audience. And I hope you all join me in thanking Nick for being here, after which the floor is yours, Nick.
Okay, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I really appreciate it. Thank you to all the organisers of this workshop. I think it's wonderful. We're getting people back together again. I'm sorry from... Okay, it says I am. I'll stop and I'll start it again. Can you see that screen now? Okay. So as I was saying, thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm sorry I can't be there in person myself. I've just got back from a trip for work over to the United States, and I didn't want my wife and children to forget what I look like. So unfortunately, I can't be there in person, but I'm sure it's going to be a wonderful event. So what I wanted to have a chat to you about today is some of the work that we're doing at the within the United Nations. Within the United Nations Global Geospatial Information Management, it's a bit of a mouthful, I know. There is a subcommittee that are focusing on geodesy. And this has been running for almost a decade now in one form or another. And the main aim and rationale for it is to get a greater appreciation for the wonderful science and work that you do and the dependence that people have on that science. So as many of you would know, the Global Geodetic Reference Frame is our invisible framework that covers our planet. And thanks to our Global Geodetic Reference Frame, we can position ourselves accurately, navigate safely, and align and combine our geospatial data to make better decisions. The Global Geodetic Reference Frame, it's actually an authoritative, reliable, highly accurate, and global geospatial referencing infrastructure. The Global Geodetic Reference Frame is actually the collection of many things. It includes coordinate reference frames, like the International Terrestrial Reference Frame. This is like our 0 point on the ruler, as you know, and it provides accurate and authoritative model of the Earth that people rely on for positioning, navigation, and the alignment of our data. It also includes the International Celestial Reference Frame, So that's using the precise locations of distant quasars we use to monitor things like the spin rate of the Earth, and importantly, our time. And it also includes infrastructure that we use to make these measurements, like GNSS, VLBI, SLR, and DORIS. And importantly, also includes our gravimetric observations, products and height systems, which we use for measurements of elevation. And importantly, the GGRF, the Global Geodetic Reference Frame, also includes the data and the analysis and the people. And these are the things that are often unfunded or under-resourced that I want to talk about today. So the Global Geodetic Reference Frame is actually a foundation for evidence-based policies, decisions that we require to deliver environmental, social, and economic benefits. With respect to the environmental, we rely on the Global Geodetic Reference Frame to monitor the changes in our environment, things like ice loss and sea level rise, the causes and the effects of climate change. From a societal point of view, we're relying on the Global Geodetic Reference Frame to incorporate accurate positioning into over 3 billion mobile phone applications. It also underpins our ability to navigate safely on the road, the oceans, and in the air. We also rely on the Global Geodetic Reference Frame for economic reasons, for things like building bridges and tunnels, making sure that when we start construction at either end, that they meet in the middle. But geodesy sits at the core of making our world function. And because it sits at the core, it's often unseen. And as a result, it's often ignored, underappreciated, and under-resourced. So to ensure that the Global Geodetic Reference Frame can serve us and help us answer the important science questions that we have for the betterment of society, it needs to be more accurate and it needs to be more accessible. We also need to make sure that we maintain its accuracy, its quality, and the accessibility. Unfortunately, as we'll cover in our brief session this morning, there are many risks and there's a multitude of potential failure points that's coming from a lack of funding and a lack of resourcing in some very key areas. These include things like a lack of world-class geodetic infrastructure, poor accessibility for some people in some regions, and a reliance on in-kind contribution and insufficient collaboration and coordination. So you benefit from geodesy every day. And so some of the examples that I try and use to try and explain geodesy to people who aren't experts like yourselves is the things like our reliance on the electricity grid, for example. When we switch on the lights or put on the kettle to make tea or coffee, you're actually drawing on electricity from a GNSS synchronized electricity grid. And when you check the weather forecast, in many places around the world now, it's actually being enhanced thanks to the noise that we geodesists call the atmosphere. That actually is being used in assimilation models developed by our Bureau of Meteorology in Australia, and I know there's similar work happening within Europe and the US. You also benefit from turn-by-turn navigation, which is optimized by crowdsourced congestion information. Geodesy doesn't just improve our lifestyle though, but it also provides us with safer and more resilient communities. So take, for example, sea level rise. Geodesy is actually the tool that we use to measure both the cause and the effects. The cause can be measured through things like the GRACE gravity satellites. Geodesists have been able to measure mass loss in Antarctica, Arctic, and Greenland. Geodesy is then also used to measure the effect. We're using satellite altimeters that are the surveying instruments we're using in space to measure these millimeter level trends in sea level variability in the open ocean. And SLR is vital to being able to measure and monitor the orbits of those satellite altimeters. What we need to do as a geodetic community is help explain that extra step to people who are interested in understanding and mitigating the impacts of climate change, how reliant we are on the evidence base that is actually coming from geodesy. A lot of people don't understand that link. This is particularly problematic in an area I've been working with people within the Pacific community, where land is actually moving as well as sea level is rising. So take, for example, this situation in Samoa in 2009 in the Pacific Ocean, where according to the data collected, the land actually sunk by about 50 millimeters over about a 6-month period when an earthquake occurred. So that approximates to almost 10 years worth of sea level rise if you're looking at sea level rise alone. What makes it worse is that you can see the post-seismic event, that the land has continued to subside by about 8 millimeters a year. So that compounds when you have land sinking and sea level rising, the relative effect to people in these communities in some Pacific islands is absolutely crisis point for them in terms of how it inundates seawater comes in, inundates very few areas where they have arable land for cropping, or can infiltrate into some of the freshwater lenses that they have for water supplies. If we're looking at it from an economic point of view, which is sometimes the way that we can try and get through to people working in government, some things we often talk about is things like economic benefits or cost benefit analysis or potential loss from the loss of the infrastructure. This can be a reasonable argument that we can try and make. So over the next few slides, I would encourage you to have a think about which of these elements may actually have an impact if you're trying to influence people within your government. And one of the interesting ones is that we're actually more dependent on geodesy than we ever have been before. So according to the wonderful GSA market reports that they put out, they're developed by the European Commission. They were looking at the downstream beneficiaries of GNSS data in terms of market revenue. And it was estimated to grow from about 150 billion euros in 2019 to 325 billion euros in 2029. And the growth in the revenue is particularly coming, as you can see in the figures here, it's particularly coming from areas where there's mass market growth in things like intelligent transport systems, like autonomous cars, and consumer solutions. For example, as I mentioned before, there's roughly 3 billion mobile phone applications that rely on positioning information from location-based services, and smartphones and fitness gear. The other interesting point is the risk associated with our dependence on geodesy. So there's been two wonderful reports that I often use. One from the US on the economic benefits of GPS, which is looking at GPS alone in 2019, and one by London Economics looking at the economic impact of loss or disruption to the GNSS system in the UK. And just roughly speaking, in both cases, they're estimating a loss of GPS or GNSS in those respective regions is the cost to the government, or in terms of GDP, of about $1 billion per day. Very significant if you're looking to try and explain the cost benefit analysis associated with geodesy. Another analogy I like to use is talking about the value chain. So I think we all have a keen focus on understanding the user benefits, but trying to understand that value chain and our dependence on the sources, whether it's our geodetic infrastructure or the analysis processes we use. I like to use the analogy of an electricity system. So electricity is another core function like geodesy that we rely on every day. And we take it for granted that when we flick the switch on the wall, that electricity will always be there. But if you think about the process or the supply chain that we go through to generate electricity, it starts from an energy source like gas or coal, and then the power plant then converts that source into electricity. It's transmitted over power lines to get to our house, and then we flick on the switch and we turn on our mobile phone. So take a look at the links in this electricity supply chain for a moment. Each link has expensive infrastructure, high reliance on qualified people, very complex analytics, and an enormous number of users. So that if there's any weaknesses in this supply chain, we get blackouts in our homes. The geodesy supply chain is very similar. We have infrastructure, which is our geodetic infrastructure. So this includes things like the SLR and VLBI instruments that we use to compute Earth orientation parameters. These EOPs are crucial and underpin the quality of all our positioning, navigation, and timing applications. For example, without Earth orientation parameters, not only does GNSS not work, but neither would things like communication satellites or Earth observation satellites. So this geodetic infrastructure is the first link in the geodesy supply chain. And to be honest, there's serious issues that need our attention. For example, much of the geodetic infrastructure we rely on is aging and degrading. More than 50% of the geodetic infrastructure that we currently use is based on old technology. We need more, newer, and better geodetic infrastructure. When it comes to production, the issues with the infrastructure have flow-on effects when it comes to the production and development of products that we rely on for the vast majority of people who use position, navigation, and timing services. At the moment, the problem with the production component in the geodesy supply chain is not obvious in some cases, and that's thanks to a very strong coalition of the willing, as we like to say, with incredible contributions coming from scientific organisations like IAG and services like yours from the ILRS. With the IAG, however, it doesn't have a massive budget like a power plant operator. In fact, IAG is heavily reliant on contributions from member state geodesy agencies that allow their highly qualified staff to perform very complex analytics, often in kind, to create the products and services that we rely on every day. And furthermore, they often give the products and services away for free. So we need to adequately resource organisations who operate this infrastructure and produce these wonderful geodetic products and services that we rely on. And we need to formalise arrangements so that our governments understand why we do this geodesy. It is not science for science sake. We are doing science for the betterment of society. And much of the infrastructure, as I mentioned, is operated under this very much coalition of the willing, which is hidden from government eyes. And we need to change that. That is our responsibility. When it comes to the transmission of geodetic products and services, the geodesy community is still using data formats which for some users aren't fit for purpose. Many of the new and emerging users in that user end are requiring things like web services to make their data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And the users of our geodetic products and services are changing rapidly. We have a duty to make sure that the data that we supply and the products and services that are paid for by taxpayer funding is made available to them in a form that they can use it. Finally, these weak links in the geodesy supply chain are putting the applications we rely on every day at risk of degradation, which can in turn affect the accuracy and reliability of our decision making. So, I would like you to stop and have a think. Could you imagine operating a multi-trillion-dollar industry on in-kind contribution, aging infrastructure, and standards which aren't fit for purpose for some users? Well, the reality is that we are doing that every day. And our governments and our industries don't actually understand the reliance that they have on this supply chain and some of the weaknesses associated with it. So recognizing, some of you might be thinking, well, what's a UN organization doing talking about geodesy? Well, recognizing the importance of geodesy for many of these economic, social, and environmental benefits as I've stepped through, the United Nations General Assembly actually adopted in 2015 a resolution titled A Global Geodetic Reference Frame for Sustainable Development. So this is in broad recognition that we need to be taking action to fix some of these issues. The role of the subcommittee is to implement this resolution, and that is to take steps to sustain the Global Geodetic Reference Frame. So in response to these complex issues, A couple of years ago, the Committee of Experts, which is a group within the UN GGIM, they're called the Committee of Experts, they endorsed a report, two reports that were published by the Subcommittee on Geodesy. And these were our strategy and our action plan to deliver a more sustainable global geodetic reference frame. The other one was on a concept paper for establishing a global geodetic centre of excellence. And what this was all about was really, for the first time, trying to provide funding for dedicated people and resources who are focused on the collaboration and coordination amongst the global geodetic community. So essentially, we're looking to bring together things like the IAG and its services and GEGOS and FIG and organisations like the International Hydrographic Commission, people like the International Standards Organisation, bring these groups together to try and resolve some of these issues and provide dedicated resources to work on some of the problems. We're hoping, fingers crossed, that the Global Geodetic Centre of Excellence will be established in Germany later this year. I want to leave you with something that can maybe motivate us, because sometimes I talk about, I'm talking about these problems and they seem so big that I'm not sure that we can resolve them. So I'd like to leave you with a marvelous story of engineering. I want you to think about a giant ocean liner streaming through the ocean. So how do you think a captain gets to move such a giant object with so much momentum and get it to change course? Do you think the captain turns its wheel and the wheel turns the rudder and the rudder turns the ship? Well, not quite. It actually happens that the rudder has a little mini rudder on it called a trim tab. And when the captain turns the ship's wheel, the wheel turns the trim tab and the trim tab turns the rudder. And then only does the rudder turn the ship. So the trim tab is that little piece there that you can see in yellow. It's a small thing, that trim tab, but it can make an ocean liner change course. That small thing can make a big change if it's in the right place and it makes that push at just the right time. So I see things like, why am I talking about a trim tab? Well, I see things like the Global Geodetic Centre of Excellence, which will be established very soon, as being like a trim tab for helping us drive change to sustain the global geodetic reference frame. If we can get it established and get all the right organisations involved, have good governance, helping us all work together, at the start, coordinating a lot of the in-kind contributions that all the wonderful people here are currently making, and hopefully provide organisations like the ILRS with some more dedicated resources to continue doing the work they do. From that, I think we can demonstrate a lot of success and hopefully allow that Global Geodetic Centre of Excellence to continue to grow, and maybe have member states, other countries, look to put and invest into the Centre of Excellence. So with that in mind, I encourage you to think about whether or not your country, if you're there representing your country, or whether or not you could go and have discussions with representatives from your country about this Centre of Excellence, and whether or not you would be willing to be involved and help collaborate and combine our efforts and be that trim tab to try and drive the change we need to try and sustain the reference frame. Thank you very much for your attention.
That was awesome. I would like to have some questions from the audience. I don't know if there are any from the chat, so I guess I should move down there. Anyone from the room? Well, I have one, Nick, then. So we all agree that what we do, geodesy, is very important. And you've shown various reports where you've shown economic hard data where we see how much loss in revenue and financial loss would be caused by any failure in this production chain. But I wonder then, and given that on the one hand, and on the other, that this is a global problem, do you see a path towards financing or helping developing infrastructure. That is the first link in your chain in countries or regions of the world where maybe they don't have all the resources to do so. Do you see a way towards that?
It's an excellent question, and it's something that we have struggled with and tried to define. My personal feeling is that we try and tackle this at very much a regional scale and then a country scale, and I'll explain why. Regions have very different needs. So if I talk about the needs in Australia, for example, what we are needing at the moment as a country, and I'll include New Zealand with that, is that we needed an SBAS service, a satellite-based augmentation service, to help us with safety of navigation for airlines, and improvement for industries in terms of more accurate precision agriculture, more safer and more sustainable mining, for example. So our focus on developing our geodetic ground infrastructure and our messaging to our government was around high integrity positioning for our society and for economic development. If you're not going to be able to use that argument in areas like the Pacific Islands, where we also are doing some work with them. Their focus is really around improving their reference frames and their datums to better understand how to mitigate climate change. So I think that a key bit of what we would like to see the Global Geodetic Centre of Excellence do is have dedicated resources in there who are able to work with regions and countries to work out what their requirements are. And for example, in the Pacific, it might be around a stronger continuously operating reference station network. But as they're putting those bids together to try and improve their GNSS network and their reference frame, we would also then want to step in and say, okay, as part of that bid that you're putting to the World Bank or Asian Development Bank, whatever it might be, we recommend that you also include funding for a VLBI station or an SLR station. So we're taking these global requirements that we need to improve the reference frame, but combining them with the regional and country level requirements when we go out for funding. So a key bit of what we need to do is do that global needs assessment, regional and country needs assessment, and then try and map a line through them to create the funding proposals, and then pick and choose where we put those funding proposals to try and maximize our wins.
Thank you. Somebody else? Toshi?
Okay. This is Toshi speaking. Thank you very much for joining us. My question, because now this is a laser ranging workshop. We all love the cartoons you showed, like our lifestyle is improved by geodesy, and following a few things, and that seems like very, good for GNSS explanation for promoting GNSS. But probably my question is a frequently asked question, but how shall we rationalize SLR, VLBI, big facilities?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, Toshi, and it's why I have great examples for things like GNSS, but don't have great examples for SLR and VLBI. And it's because, as you well know, GNSS is the access point. That's how people access geodesy and use geodesy and see the benefit from geodesy. So the argument that we have been making in Australia, for example, if I use our country, is that we talk when we're gathering support for the kind of work that we're doing, we explain to people that GNSS doesn't work without laser ranging, or GNSS doesn't work without VLBI. So we have it as a dependency. It's a lot harder to explain to someone why SLR and VLBI are important. But what you can say that is, if you want GNSS to work, you need SLR and VLBI, because without them, we don't have a reference frame and we don't have Earth orientation parameters. So you almost make it a non-negotiable. It is very hard because it's at the core and at the foundation, And if anyone has any better ideas than what I have suggested, please let me know, because it keeps me up at night trying to think of them.
Thank you.
Okay, Bea, I don't know if there's any questions from the online audience. There were none. So if there's no further questions from here, Nick, thank you very much for this wonderful talk. Please, let's thank again, Nick.